take it away.
Okay. Yeah, I'm excited about this event. Let's see. So in the book, I talk about capacity for welfare across species, because I think this is a crucial issue if we want to compare welfare between different species. So in the literature, you see like people raising the issue whether an 8 out of 10 of a dog or a mouse is the same as an 8 out of 10 for a human. And without having an answer to that question, we seem not to be able to compare welfare across species. And I think there are like two mutually exclusive views on this issue. One of them I call the difference view, and the other I call the equality view. And these are the views that I discuss in the book. Ultimately, I reject the difference view, or I argue against the difference view and in favor of the equality view. So the difference view says welfare subjects such as humans, dogs, and mice have fundamentally different capacities for welfare due to their different cognitive and emotional capacities. Here are some examples. They are partly also found in Kagan's work. Quote from Kitcher: "A fly's life doesn't amount to a lot, even at the best of times." And you might all be familiar with John Stuart Mill's claim, "It's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied." Or from Frey: "The fullest mouse life there has ever been does not approach the full life of a human." In contrast, the equality view says that welfare subjects have fundamentally equal capacities for welfare, despite their different cognitive or emotional capacities. Here's an example of how that might work, or someone who seems to accept an equality view. This is from an animal welfare scientist from the Netherlands, Mark Brakke, 2006 paper. He compared the welfare of laying hens in battery cages to the welfare of dairy cows at pasture. He did this by identifying a list of needs that these animals have, and then like checking out for each need to what extent it is fulfilled for the animal in question. So a score of 4 means full fulfillment of the need, complete fulfillment. So for example, the need for food would here be fully fulfilled for both species, as well as the need for water, and the need for rest would be like not fully fulfilled for laying hens in battery cages, but fully fulfilled for dairy cows at pasture, and so on for different needs. You can also like weigh needs according to their importance, and then you come up with a number. And in principle, if you use that methodology, different species can have the same maximum or minimum score. So now I want to like quickly run through the contents of my book. After the introduction, I have a chapter about the difference view. So as I said, I take diff and EQ to be mutually exclusive. So accepting one of these views implies rejecting the other. In chapter 2, I criticize all major defenses of diff in the philosophical literature that I am aware of. In his book, How to Count Animals, more or less, from 2019, Shelley Kagan argues for different moral consideration, different moral status of different welfare subjects. In that book, Kagan accepts and defends the view that sentient animals differ in their capacity for welfare. He argues for diff based on an objective list account of welfare. And that objective list account needs to have specific features in order to support diff. Kagan's arguments are internally consistent, but I raise doubts about the plausibility of the underlying objective list account of welfare. So for example, whether mathematical understanding is intrinsically good for all species. In Practical Ethics, Peter Singer presented an argument intended to show that a certain amount of time in a well-off human's life contains more welfare than the same amount of time in a well-off horse's life. The idea was that if you could experience the human's life as a human and the horse's life as a horse, we would then, from a third and neutral position, prefer the human's life. This was an argument for diff based on whole life preferentialism, which doesn't work for various reasons, as Peter, I think, now admits. John Stuart Mill's thoughts on higher and lower pleasures amount to a defense of diff because it implies that cognitively more advanced individuals can experience more welfare because higher pleasures are available to them. I criticize that view, both like categorical reasons against it, and also like actual results from neuroscience don't suggest that we have two different pleasure circuits. Jeff McMahon holds, based on an objectivist account of welfare, that humans are typically much better off than the happiest of dogs. To avoid the implication that from an egalitarian or prioritarian perspective, we have to be concerned about the relatively worse off happy dogs rather than the humans, Jeff McMahon invents the notion of fortune and argues that happy dogs, despite their low welfare in comparison with humans, are not unfortunate. And he says that fortune is sometimes relevant for what we ought to do rather than welfare. But when it comes to welfare, McMahon accepts diff on the basis of an objectivist account. Kevin Wong explicitly tackles the issue of cross-species comparisons of welfare for effective altruists and says that even though a dog may be very well off for a dog, he may at the same time have only little absolute welfare as compared to a typical human. So Wong explicitly defends diff, and I criticize his arguments in detail in the book. Lastly, Budolfsson and Spears, in their paper, they do not explicitly defend diff. They present a formula for comparing welfare across species that allows for a discount factor in case an 8 out of 10 for dog counts for less in absolute terms than an 8 out of 10 for human. They refer to Wong's work as well. In the example of how the formula may be put to work, they discount based on neuron counts. When I challenged Budolfsson about that, he said that his main point was to present a formula which is compatible with a discount factor of 0. This is true, even though in his paper he talks as if some discount factor would certainly make sense. So in the chapter 3, I turn to what might count in favor of the equality view. In chapter 3.1, I look at what animal welfare scientists say about welfare. Most of them do not explicitly compare welfare or capacities for welfare across species yet. Some do, as for example, Mark Brucker, who focuses on the extent to which their needs are fulfilled, as I already told you. Animal welfare scientists defend indicators for welfare. Therefore, they must have some ideas about what these indicators are supposed to indicate. They express some underlying ideas about what welfare is. When they do so, they talk about the extent to which animals cope with their environment, fulfill their needs or preferences, survive and reproduce, are free from pain and suffering, fulfill their natures, etc. These considerations, if extrapolated to comparisons across species, are most naturally understood as suggesting the equal capacity for welfare view. In chapter 3.2, I explore Daniel Hebron's self-fulfillment account of welfare as just one example of a relativizing or proportional theory of welfare. After all relativizing or proportional theories of welfare necessarily imply EQ due to their structure. If welfare consists in the extent to which you fulfill yourself, whatever it is, then different animals have different selves, but in principle, a mouse can fulfill herself as well as a human can fulfill himself. Hebron understands self-fulfillment in terms of happiness and success in identity-related projects. In chapter 3.3, I talk to hedonists. Hedonism is not a relativizing or proportional view of welfare. It looks at the total amount of pleasure that a being experiences at a time. But as an empirical matter of fact, I argue that different sentient animal species have the same capacity for pleasure. That is due to the nature and evolutionary function of pleasure. Unfortunately, I cannot say more about that argument now. I come to chapter 4. In chapter 4, I extend the discussion from comparisons of welfare at a time, synchronic welfare, to welfare across longer time spans, diachronic welfare. I suggest going along with a simple additive view about lifetime welfare, which is the dominant view in the literature. The longer a happy or good life is, the better it is. So animals' capacity for lifetime welfare depends on their lifespans, in addition to their capacity for momentary welfare. In chapter 5, I make clear that views about capacity for welfare have normative implications, but only in conjunction with normative views. Your empirical assumptions also matter for what follows from these views about capacity for welfare. I discuss some examples of combinations of normative views, empirical assumptions, and views about cross-species capacity for welfare. So if you don't like some alleged implications of a view that might be due to the normative assumptions that you make or the empirical assumptions that you make, in addition, or rather than the view about capacity for welfare that you accept. I think I will leave my summary here.
All right, fantastic. Okay, thank you so much for that summary, Tatjana. I think we're going to have Peter Singer will speak first, then Peter Sandøe, and then Travis Timmerman. So Peter, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks very much, Bob, and thanks very much, Tatjana, mainly for your book, of course, also for your quick summary just there. But I want to echo what Bob said at the beginning, that I think you have done something bold and important in writing the book, in treading where few dare to tread. In general, the whole issue of cross-species comparisons of welfare has seemed so difficult to many people that relatively few people have written it or on it or tried to argue for particular positions on it. And not only have you done that in the sense of raising the area, but you've argued for a particularly bold claim, at least seems to me to be a particularly bold claim, and that is the equal thesis that you've just mentioned, that welfare subjects have fundamentally equal capacities for welfare, despite their different cognitive or emotional capacities. And I think that by making that claim, you focus the debate and you provide a thesis that people can disagree with and can produce arguments for or against. And I think that really helps to get this whole field going, to have, if you like, a target like that. You might not like to think of yourself as having painted a big bullseye target on yourself, but obviously if you go out in a new or relatively new field and you stake out a claim for a thesis like this, that's what's going to happen. And that is, I suppose, part of this symposium, and the discussion will continue, but that's the way philosophy works. And I congratulate you on getting that started. So as you just mentioned in your summary, you do present in chapter 2, section 2, you do discuss a view that I presented in practical ethics throughout, I think, really all of the different editions of practical ethics up to the present one, which is now 12 years old, 13 years old, from 2011. So as you say, I presented there a form of preferentialism or preference utilitarianism. And in that discussion, rather tentatively, I tried to argue that it would be reasonable to choose a life with a greater degree of self-awareness and rationality and a broader range of possible experiences over one that, in which, although you were a conscious or sentient being, you had less or no self-awareness and rationality. Now, you make several objections to this view, some of which I acknowledge. In fact, already in presenting the argument, I acknowledge the difficulty of really saying, is there a possible neutral standpoint? But I don't think that all of your objections are compelling. And for example, you argue that on this view, that this view is incompatible with the standard account of self-sacrifice, because whatever one does is what one prefers to do. And therefore, you're always increasing your own welfare. So no self-sacrifice, which reminded me of the report of the incident when Thomas Hobbes, who of course defended the view that we always act on our own interests, gave alms to a beggar, and his companion seized on this moment to claim, you've just refuted your own theory because you haven't acted as an egoist. And Hobbes replied, consistently with his theory, that it pleased him to see the beggar made happy. Now, that may indeed conflict with standard accounts of self-sacrifice or egoism, but I don't think that's really a problem, because clearly we would want to praise people who, like Hobbes, are pleased by seeing others made happy, especially if they make others happy to a much greater degree than they cause themselves to be less happy, in terms of the material fact that Hobbes could no longer spend the money he gave to the beggar on something for himself. So, you know, I don't think that's a real problem for the view that I was defending. But I won't spend more of my time defending on what I wrote in 2011, because as you just said in your introduction, I no longer hold that view. I no longer consider myself a preference utilitarian. And if there's some of you in the audience don't know about that, or are interested in the reasons why I made that change, I'm going to suggest you read The Point of View of the Universe by myself and Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek, in which we defend Sidgwick's hedonistic form of utilitarianism and explain why we think it's preferable to preference utilitarianism. So let me then address what you say from this perspective. What of hedonism? Does it suggest that all subjects of welfare have fundamentally equal capacities for welfare? And first, let me say, you mentioned Mill's distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Let me say that I follow Bentham and Sidgwick in rejecting Mill's distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Bentham famously said, quantities of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry. For the purposes of this discussion, we could adapt this to something like quantities of pleasure being equal, a dog fetching a stick is as good as poetry. But of course, Bentham's remark is conditional on quantities of pleasure being equal. And I clearly accept that. But the question is, are they equal? And not only for poetry and chasing a stick, but for everything that each species is capable of getting pleasure from. And as Tatjana just indicated, her main argument that these capacities are equal is in chapter 3, section 3, entitled An Evolutionary Perspective. Here she argues that, I quote, sensory pleasure describes a stimulus's usefulness for correcting physiological trouble or deficit, and thereby improving short-term and, in combination with learning, also long-term survival value. And a little bit later in the same section, she says that pleasure, quote, indicates a stimulus's objective usefulness at the time. I can't agree with these claims because firstly, it seems odd to say that sensory pleasure describes anything. It's, in my view, a feeling, and feelings don't describe. But secondly, putting that minor point aside, whatever the origin of our capacity to feel pleasure, evolution doesn't keep us on such a tight leash that we can only experience pleasure from things that conduce to our survival. Many animals play in ways that don't have any obvious survival value. Just go to YouTube, It's full of videos showing this. They just seem to be enjoying themselves and having fun, which is great, of course. And we humans put a huge amount of energy into doing things that give us pleasure, irrespective of our survival value, and sometimes, in fact, at considerable risk to our survival value, whether it's taking drugs that we believe are going to give us pleasure, or free climbing El Capitan in Yosemite, which presumably gave the climber pleasure. And I think here perhaps there is a case for a difference in capacities because of our greater ingenuity in finding things that will give us greater pleasure, that will extend our pleasure. We put a lot of energy, and of course corporations that can profit from it are going to put a lot of money into trying to market things that will give us more pleasure, sell them to us. Now, often that's spurious. They're just trying to make money and they're fooling us into thinking that we're going to get more pleasure, but not always. Sometimes I think we do find things that give us greater pleasure in that way. And so perhaps, therefore, we do extend our capacities for pleasure and welfare by using these cognitive capacities that we have. I also want to point out that later in this section, Tatjana makes a concession that seems to me to undermine her defense of equality, and I'll quote this. Some animals may have only relatively dim sensations as compared to us. Their sensations may not be intense. Perhaps these relatively dim sensations are sufficient for them to survive in their ecological niche, just as our relatively poor sense of smell as compared to a wolf is sufficient for us. This indeed does seem very likely to me, given that consciousness has evolved over hundreds of millions of years from much simpler organisms. It seems obvious that, like other capacities, like sight, smell, and hearing, at first it evolved in a less acute or intense form and then developed further because some organisms in some ecological niches had their survival enhanced by the mutations that led to more intense sight, smell, and hearing, and more intense sensations. And that could be, of course, sensations of pain, very often would be, as well as of pleasure. It seems to me that that's likely to be true and likely to actually have quite a wide range of intensities of sensations. Tatjana, though, points out then that if the relevant species has a hedonic dimension of consciousness at all, the fact that the species has only dim sensations does not entail that the range of the hedonic dimension is narrower than ours. And as a matter of logic, no doubt that's true. Strictly speaking, the fact that a being has only very dim sensations does not entail that they're unable to feel pleasures or pains as intensely as we are. But it still seems to me to be overwhelmingly likely that that is going to be the case. The work of neuroscience, and Tatjana refers to Morten Kringelbach, for example, and his work on pleasure, and his work and that of other scientists describe brain processes that lead to our experiences of pleasure that are certainly shared with other non-human animals, particularly those closer to us, mammals, birds, vertebrates, but still will involve many more neurons than are possessed by simpler beings that it's nevertheless reasonable to believe may be conscious and may have a welfare. So if that's so, I think it's unlikely that the equal thesis is true, that we do all have simply equal fundamental capacities for welfare. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Peter Sandøe, we will jump to the next set of comments.
I'll just try to get my slides up and running. So here we are. Is it up and running?
Yep. Looks good.
Wonderful. First, I like the other Peter, would like to congratulate Tatjana. I think, like the other Peter, that you raised and discussed an extremely important question about welfare across species. And I also think it's great that you situate it in a broader practical context, so it actually has some implications, even though that's not the main focus of your book. But I think also the most important thing is reminding us of our propensity to sloppy, wishful thinking on this matter. I mean, A lot of people in practice actually are what Peter Singer would call speciesists. But if you have the excuse to say, well, they don't feel so much, then in a way you're not a speciesist, technically speaking, because that's the difference. So it would be a very convenient way to get off the hook, that you can claim that other beings are not feeling the same things as we do. So I think that's also for that reason, because we have this propensity, it's really nice to be challenged. And I also think it's good that you go beyond philosophy to animal welfare science for inspiration. But I was told not to spend all my time praising you, so I will spend a bit of energy on some comments. And I was chosen because I'm actually a philosopher by training, but for many years I've also been doing animal welfare science, so I'll look a bit to the animal welfare science side of it. I have 3 comments. Say first, I don't really see whether you believe in EQ, and the other one has any implications for ability to compare welfare. So I'll start talking about that. Then I think you overstate what animal welfare science has to contribute here. You need to take a much more humble view on animal welfare science, and I'll try to explain that. And then I'll end up with what I think is the main unclarity in your book, is whether you're claiming that it's an empirical or an a priori matter. And I think if you're going to join forces with animal welfare science, it has to be an empirical and not an a priori matter. So that will be my approach. So let me start quoting this bit of your book, which I'll take my starting point. This book is mainly concerned with a central question to cross-species comparison, inquires whether welfare subjects of different species have the same or rather different capacity for welfare, and then comes a point that without an answer to this question, welfare cannot be compared across species. It's not entirely clear what you're saying. Either you say that you need EQ to compare, but also you could also mean that you need to have a stand on that before you start comparing. And I'll just give a very down-to-earth example here. These are 2 very similar, in principle, very similar things. This is pest control. We control, many people do, control flies, and they control rodents. And here 2 methods of doing that. Flies is a fly paper, and then there's a glue trap for rodents. I live in a country where glue traps for rodents are banned, and I think it's a really, really cruel way of doing pest control. So I'm vehemently opposed to that. I have to admit, I actually I live in the countryside and use fly papers in the summer. It might be because I'm just too much of a speciesist toward flies, but it could also be a difference in welfare. So this is a really important practical question. Well, should we say that from the point of view of welfare, these are on par? Of course, there can be other reasons why they're not on par. It could be that, as it is actually the case with rodents, there are better ways, more welfare-friendly ways, but it could be with flies, we have no better welfare ways. So that's the question I'm raising here. Well, is it really plausible that, well, following Tatjana, that we need to know in advance that they have the same welfare level to discuss this? I used to be a skeptic about insect pain, but then I read a lot of good work recently. I think particularly a philosopher, Jonathan Birch, has done very useful stuff in alerting our minds to that insects, actually there's a much better case to be made for insect sentience than some of us has thought hitherto. But if you look into one of his papers, done with a number of other people, then you can see the group of flies are the group of Diphthera. And you can see that there are some ways where at least there's very little evidence. Of course, a lack of evidence is not evidence of absence. I mean, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but at least if you look at the evidence, there are areas where you can allow yourself some skepticism given the current status of science, where you cannot allow yourself that skepticism with mice and rats. And assuming that you come to the conclusion that the life of a fly, the inner life of a fly, is much simpler, and even though it feels pain, it doesn't feel the kind of despair that you would feel as if you're a rat or mouse trapped in a glue trap, where my impression is it must just be endlessly dreadful to sit there and cannot get away, and you know these animals end up actually trying to eat their own legs off to be able to escape. And why couldn't you have the view that, okay, I can compare, and even if accept diff in the case of flies and mice, I can still compare and say, well, the conclusion is that flies probably feel pain, and they most likely feel pain, but they do not feel pain to the same intensity, and they don't feel some of the other really horrible sides of negative welfare that a mouse or rat would feel. So whether you go for diff or EQ, I think you can equally well make comparisons. You'll just sort of bring in your thoughts about the welfare level they have as part of the comparison. So I fail to see why this should be really important for the ability to make comparisons. That was my first one. Second comment concerns Tatjana's use of animal welfare science. Tatjana says that approach of animal welfare sciences seem to be closer to EQ than diff. Animals can, in principle, all cope to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the individual circumstances. They can similarly fulfill their needs or preference to a greater or lesser extent, and complete fulfillment equals maximum welfare. It follows that a welfare score out of 8 out of 10 for a chicken is the same as an 8 out of 10 for a mouse, because welfare is nothing but the extent to which an individual is coping or fulfilling her preferences or needs. I must say that I don't fully, a bit like Peter Singer, I don't follow this argument fully, because what all it says is that, well, if you have a scale from 0 to 10, then you can compare, but you need to make sure that the 10 means the same in both cases. And I fail to see that, even though they can all be measured on certain scales, that the scales sort of in absolute terms must mean the same. I think that was also the upshot of what Peter Singer said about this about this part. So I'm not fully convinced about that. But what I want to bring in is more now the links to animal welfare science. You only have one quotation from Mark Brackett. I think it's a very theoretical paper. I don't think Mark seriously there actually wants to argue they have exactly the same level of welfare. It just seems that you can compare them on a very simple scale. I think it's fair to say that equality is a starting point. If you're an animal welfare scientist, you have an open mind. It's an empirical question. You will not prejudice it from the start. But it's not fair to say that animal welfare science supports EQ and the further claim that all species with welfare will in practice aspire to the same level of welfare level. Firstly, because animal welfare science, if you look into it, so far 99% of it has focused on studying welfare compromise, negative welfare. So very little work has actually so far been done about the full welfare scale. Most of animal welfare science is looking at welfare compromise. The study of positive welfare is its infancy, and people are still struggling about what exactly to mean by positive welfare. So it is not as if you go into animal welfare science and find a full set of equipments by means of which you can measure positive welfare. That's still something they're discussing how to do it. Most studies, again 99% probably, focus on specific aspects. You go in and compare two ways of treating a chicken to get a certain, and its effect on a specific welfare problem. That's the majority of it. And if you go beyond that, and then you face what I've called in several publications the aggregation problem, is that you measure different things, and then how do you add them up? How do you sum them up? And as I've argued, that dealing with this problem will partly be based on ethical assumptions. Whether you believe in it's important to promote the lower or the higher things. There'll be lots of ethically informed decisions to be made if you're going to do aggregation. So thereby, this idea that you can just do value-free welfare assessment and afterwards discuss its ethical implication is probably not true. Some efforts have been made within animal welfare science to compare welfare of groups of animals within the same species. I'm actually one of those who have published about this. This is from a study we did about broiler chicken. This came out in Poultry Science. This is an update of what you see in Poultry Science. But the idea is that you can go into different countries and then you can measure how much welfare are broiler chicken, meat chicken, given. The idea is that we divide all the things you can give to a chicken up in a list. For example, how much spage, how much enrichment, whether you look foot pad dermatitis, and all these other technical things. And then for each of them, then you can ask some welfare experts, how much value do you put on each value within a certain dimension? And then you can ask the experts, how much does this dimension mean compared to other dimensions? And by means of that, then you can add up all the things that are given to these animals in different countries. And some countries give more and because they have better legislation, or give more because they have more so-called market-driven animal welfare. And then you can make these comparisons. So of course you can do that, but that's only within one species. Then I try to imagine myself, suppose I was going to do a similar exercise comparing across species. Then firstly, no one has done that so far as I know within animal welfare science. But secondly, that will be mind-bogglingly difficult. I mean, because the problem is that with the system we use, which is, as far as I know, the most advanced so far, you look at sort of the particular resource the animal have. But if you go across animals with very different kinds of resources, how do you put them into the same system? And how do you make these comparisons and gradings across animals with very different kinds of needs? It might be done, just maybe my lack of current imagination, but currently, to my impression, no one has done it. So animal welfare science haven't even touched on that issue. So I think using animal welfare science is an overstatement, and just taking out one researcher who has done this funny little piece where he just adds numbers doesn't mean that animal welfare science in general will support your view in this case, because they will be agnostic about it. Then the last thing I want to look at is your comparison of a mouse and a human welfare. Just an example, you say a well-off mouse is roughly as well-off as a well-off dog as a well-off human. The average benefit that we can bestow on a mouse at a time is not necessarily smaller than the one we can bestow on a dog or human. A mouse that loses a year of life may well lose as much welfare as a dog or a human who lose a year of life. At the very least, it's far from settled that the contrary is the case. Firstly, this piece is nicely ambiguous. It's written in a very ambiguous way. It can either mean they have the same welfare, or at least they can aspire to the same welfare, or it's not a priori given that they cannot. And that's where I think the biggest ambiguity of the whole book is, and where I also think in a way will decide the fate of your future collaboration with animal welfare science. Because I think there are two different interpretations of the claim, both supported by the text. One is that we already know that in a day in the life of a well-off fly contains the same amount of welfare as a day in a well-off mouse as a well-off human. I mean, some readings of the books, also those that Peter Singer pointed out, seem to point to that. We already know that. Or it could be that we do not know a priori whether a day in the life of a well-off fly contains the same amount of welfare as a day in the life of a well-off mouse as a well-off human. And if you think we know, we ought to stop and carefully consider the empirical foundation of that claim. I happen to agree with the latter claim, and acceptance of that claim will open for further full collaboration between animal ethics and animal welfare science. And I think what we've seen recently also with this advent of study of insect welfare, that we shouldn't take all these things for granted. I mean, looking back in the history of philosophy, philosophers are very prone to have very simplistic views about animal minds. So we have a lot to learn. We have a lot of opportunities to sort of enrich our understanding and feel more empathy. But assuming from the start that this is just a conceptual matter in a way would make any collaboration with animal welfare science useless. So that's my main concern. I think I would hope that the upshot is that, well, we don't know and we need to take it carefully, seriously, but saying that we already know from a philosophical argument will in a way close this discussion. So these were my main comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much.
Sharing.
Great, excellent. One more set of comments from Travis Timmerman.
All right, thank you. While I pull this up, I just want to echo both Peter's sentiments, thanking Tatjana for writing such an interesting book. And it's one that covers an area that has been so seldomly discussed that it just breaks a lot of new ground. I learned a lot from reading it. Since she got in on the ground floor with this book too, there's a good chance that it's going to be enormously influential in the literature. So I congratulate her on that. Okay, so I want to talk very briefly about animal welfare science, but I'm hardly going to mention it at all because I don't want to repeat Peter's comments. Then I want to give a case that has a structure that I think puts pressure on every relativized view, where the structure reduces the total size of liquid in the jar, so to speak, the total amount of things that you get that seem intrinsically valuable, but also reduces the size of the jar, so to speak. So relativized views are going to entail that these choices would enhance your well-being, and that seems surprising. And then lastly, I wanted to raise a few questions about the relationship between momentary and total well-being, and whether there's a plausible way to account for that on equalizing views, which I am skeptical of. Okay, so the thing that I'll just say briefly about the animal welfare science bit is I'd like to invite Tatjana to say a little bit more about what it is exactly that the animal welfare scientists are saying that suggests that they align themselves more with the equal capacity for welfare view rather than the different capacity for welfare view, right? So she grants that they're not attempting necessarily to answer this question. They might be picking out different indicators of welfare when they do things like talk about the 5 freedoms in the Bramble report. That's one of the main ones that she cites, and that says, animals should have freedom from hunger and thirst. They should have freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury and disease, freedom to express normal behavior, and freedom from fear and distress. The idea is the degree to which you can be free from these things is going to range from 0 to 100. But it's not clear to me that this or anything else that the animal welfare scientists she cites say is aiming to pick out the fundamental constituents of well-being rather than these indicators of welfare. When you look at the motivation for things like the Bramble report, they're focused on practical issues, giving general recommendations for how to, when we interact with animals, follow certain general guidelines that would improve their overall welfare. And if we view it in that way, then what they write is just as consistent with the equal capacity for welfare as a different capacity for welfare view. So I'm just not sure why this is even suggesting subtly they might implicitly be committing themselves to thinking that the equal capacity for welfare view is true. But even if they were doing that, which would be quite surprising since they're not philosophers, it's very unlikely that they would be thinking about the fundamental constituents of well-being as opposed to indicators of welfare. With the exception of Peter and maybe a few others that have training, animal welfare scientists who are not engaged in the philosophical literature, that don't have a background in philosophy, just don't seem to have the epistemic authority to address such questions. So without sort of an argument that they gave that I could read and understand and feel compelled by, even if they were implicitly committing themselves or saying things that were more in line with the equal capacity of welfare view, I mean, that's a philosophical question. So I don't know why that would move the needle. Okay, that's what I want to say about that. Now, relativized views. Tatjana gives this very helpful sort of analogy in her book to try to explain what's going on with relativized views. You can think about this sort of as, containers that hold liquid. And then let's suppose that the liquid in the containers that's blue is an indicator of the amount of what you might think of as intrinsically valuable. And what's unique to all relativized views is that what's supposed to matter is not the total amount of the liquid in the jar, so to speak. So not the, if you're talking about hedonism, say, not the net amount of hedonic well-being that's accrued, but really the extent to which the jar is full. And this is how Tatjana can remain neutral on what the correct account of well-being is, but suggests that the equal capacity of welfare view is true regardless of that, because they can all be understood, or they can all be reframed, or they all have analog versions that are relativized in this way. So like a simple version of desire satisfactionism, say it's not the total amount of desire satisfaction, looking at the number and strength of the desire satisfied, and also looking at the numbers of aversions that are thwarted. It's really the percentage of your desires that you have satisfied that determines your overall well-being. And the extent to which anyone can have their desire satisfied, human or non-human, is 100%, and the least of which is 0%. Okay, so I think this is a helpful analogy, but now I want to put pressure on this with a case that I call Elderly Eileen. There's a lot of text here, sorry, so I'm just going to read it, read along with me and have fun. So Elderly Eileen lives an unusually good life. She's a complex person, like many of you are, with many strongly held nuanced desires, all of which are miraculously satisfied apart from one. So she's doing better than pretty much all of us right now. But the one desire that she has that's not satisfied is the mildest desire that the Phoenix Suns win the NBA championship. a desire that will never be satisfied during the remainder of her life. So that's just a basketball team in Arizona. The thing is that Eileen barely cares about this. It literally occupies mere seconds of her thought annually. When she's reminded of their failure to win, she shrugs it off with near indifference, quickly forgetting about them until the next NBA championship. What she does have, though, is the ability to take great joy in having all of her maximally strong desires satisfied. This includes, but is by no means limited to, her illustrious career as an artist, her time with her chosen family, with whom she shares a long history, traveling around the world, learning about different cultures, time with her biological family, who she loves dearly, indulging in her improbably numerous hobbies that require hard-earned skills, playing tennis, baking, solving complex mathematical problems, reading, writing, contemporary analytic philosophy, gardening, playing the bagpipes, senior citizen, MMA fighting, and the list goes on and on. She's just lives what we would all think of as a very, very rich life. Okay, now suppose that she's given the following option. She can take a pill that would change her desire about the Suns. It would instill the mildest desire that they lose the NBA championship every year rather than win. Right? So the pill would change that desire, thereby making it satisfied because they will continue to lose every year. But there's a side effect to that. The side effect is that it eradicates every other desire that she has and renders her incapable of having preferences about any of these things. She'll become indifferent to whether her relationship with her families deteriorate, whether she gets to partake in any of her hobbies, the trajectory of her career as an artist. She'll feel far less joy every day, rendered mostly passive by her near indifference to everything in her life apart from the Suns losing, a prospect that she continues to barely care about. While she barely cares about it, this preference is satisfied once annually, once they lose again and again and again. Okay, so now we can ask this question. Is it in Eileen's prudential interest to take the pill? I want to say clearly it's not in her interest to do this. But a relativized desire satisfactionism implies that she's prudentially obligated to do this because it, using Tatjana's metaphor, shrinks the size of the jar exponentially down to this one minimal desire and then satisfies it. So it shrinks the jar down exponentially, but then it makes the jar 100% full. Whereas if she hadn't taken the pill, she would have a much, much, much larger jar, so to speak. That is, we can suppose 99.99% full. Okay. Now, one response is, well, okay, that seems like a really implausible relativized version of desire satisfactionism. But maybe we just shouldn't think that's the correct account of well-being, and we should accept a relativized account of some other view of well-being. Relativized hedonism, relativized perfectionism, relativized some kind of nature of the kind view or whatnot. But the problem is that all relativized views share this structure that what matters, except for hedonism, right? So Tatjana gives a different kind of relativizing view for hedonism, but all non-hedonic accounts of well-being share the structure that the percent to which the jar, so to speak, is filled is what determines your overall well-being, not the amount of liquid in the jar, not the amount of things that you get that seem like their intrinsic value. And once you relativize a view in that way, I could construct a structurally identical example that would illustrate the same point and push on the same intuitions, regardless of the account of well-being question. Okay, and they're all going to, I think, implausibly imply that would be prudentially required to significantly reduce the total amount of what we get that seems intrinsically good, totally shrink our jar if it fills it up even a little bit more. Okay, I mean, why is this implausible? We might bite the bullet, but I think it's intuitive on its face, but Eileen will also have far fewer and far more minor desires satisfied. She'll accomplish far less, and she'll be far less happy. Since Tatjana's relativized accounts in this form of relativation are all non-hedonic, then every example that I can give can have this structure where the agent is far less happy as a result of switching jars. And one other thing that seems particularly weird about this implication is that the amount of life that Eileen loses considered in isolation would be very good for her by everybody's account, including Tatjana's, right? So we could imagine a variation of the case where Eileen's desires are relativized to times. And the time that she has the desire that the Suns win is preceded by all these other desires that she would have about living a rich and full life that would be satisfied. And the pill would only satisfy the desire at the time that she has the Suns and then eradicate any future desires. And that subsequent life that she would miss out on as a side effect of the pill would imply that it would be good for her, right? Considered in isolation. So if a portion of your life that is good for you is taken away, it's hard to see how that could make your life better. Now, admittedly, some holistic accounts of well-being will have this entailment. Maybe I think meaningfulness works together in such a way that if you live a life like Elvis when he becomes a lounge singer, that makes his life overall less good. I actually think that's a problem for holistic accounts of well-being, but it's a bigger problem, I think, for these relativized views because there's no plausible sort of holistic goods that are lost when you remove these additional parts of someone's life in order to shrink the size of the jar, so to speak. Okay, the last thing I'll say is about the relationship between momentary and total well-being. So total well-being, I'm just using that to refer to the net receipt of intrinsic good accrued over the course of one's life. Momentary well-being, the net receipt of intrinsic goods accrued at a moment in time. Now, the equal capacity for welfare view concerns how much well-being any animal can accrue at a moment in time. So the thought is that no animal at any point in time is able to accrue more net good or more net bad than the alternative animal. Okay, now we can ask, well, what's the relationship between the equal capacity for welfare view and total well-being? And Tatjana in her book narrows it down to, I think, what she thinks of as maybe the two viable options. So one is the simple additive view, which holds that the goodness of a whole life consists in the sum of the goodness of its moments. So the thought is just figure out how well any animal is doing at each moment in time. You add all those up and that'll tell you how well they did over the course of their life. Whereas the alternative is a relativized to natural lifespan view, which holds that well-being is a function of the amount of net good accrued relative to its species-specific lifespan. So the thought is, this kind of goes to the example that Jeff McMahon gave, when a dog dying at 14 might be less bad for it than a human dying at 14, even if the deprivational badness is going to be the same, even if the amount of good life that each animal in question would have had would have been identical. And the thought is because humans have a longer natural lifespan. Okay, so Tatjana herself rejects the relativized view because she says it would imply that a dog would lose more than a human in terms of total well-being if each died a year prior to the time that a member of species can expect to live. And she justifies this judgment in part by stating that it is better to have a longer, happier life than a shorter, happy life. And denying this would be extremely counterintuitive. Okay, so far so good. I mean, that seems right to me. I also want to just say the relative to natural life view ban has to be false because people that have exceeded what the species-specific lifespan is, the view would imply that their death isn't bad for them, even if they would have lived a much longer, happier life. So like Norman Lloyd dies at 108, and if he didn't die then, maybe he would have lived to 109. This is going to imply that that's not bad for him. Okay, so here's my worries about that though. Why accept a relativizing structure for synchronic capacity for welfare, but not this total capacity for welfare? I don't see a principled reason to do that, and if absent a principled reason, I worry that it's objectionably ad hoc. Now, Tatjana is going to say, well, we want to capture this intuition that a longer, happier life is better than a shorter, happier life. And I agree that's an important intuition to capture, but then similar plausible intuitions, I think, are lost when we think about the equal capacity for welfare view when we're talking about well-being at a time. So if this intuition that a longer, happier life is enough to deny that we should relativize total accounts of well-being, then why isn't it the case that the intuition that more good at a time is enough to deny the equal capacity for welfare view? I mean, presumably it's better to have a longer, happier life than a shorter, happier life because the former contains more liquid in the jar, so to speak. That's what Tatjana seems to assume. But if that's right, then why isn't the same true about synchronic well-being when we're talking about well-being at a time, or momentary well-being, is what I should say. Okay, and the counterintuitive implications cut both ways. But here's what I think might be a bigger issue, is when you take the equal capacity for welfare view and couple it with the simple additive view, I think that generates results that are at least as, perhaps more counterintuitive than the one that Tatjana uses to reject the relative to natural lifespan view. Right. So quahogs are a type of clam or bivalve. I don't know whether they're welfare subjects, but if they are, they're very rudimentary welfare subjects. But they can live hundreds of years. And their jar, so to speak, is presumably going to be very small and could quite easily be filled. Now, if you take the equal capacity for welfare view and then couple it with the total additive view, if you don't relativize total well-being, then her view is going to entail not only that quahogs can live lives that are as good as humans at any moment of time, but that quahogs are going to live lives that are 6, 7, 8 times better than the best human life, just in virtue of being able to live so much longer. And if quahogs are not welfare creatures, you can plug in any cognitively rudimentary creature that would be a subject of welfare, and then imagine that they live a long life, and then you're going to get that same sort of problem. So it's almost even worse than the repugnant inclusion in population ethics, because you can reduce the total amount of what seems like intrinsic value at each moment in time and spread out the amount of time that you get a little bit of intrinsic value. And then you, with the simple additive view, you get the view that those lives are comparably better. And that's something that I find hard to believe. If the amount of liquid in the jar matters over the course of one's whole life, then it seems like it should matter at a moment in time. And if you want to treat those things separately, then you can take less liquid, spread it out over a longer period of time, and then get the conclusion that that life is better. That I find hard to believe. Okay, so the worry is if the equal capacity of welfare view generates implausible results when combined with the simple additive view, and its alternative doesn't yield plausible results either, then that looks like it puts pressure on having to reject the equal capacity welfare view to avoid these counterintuitive results. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Travis. Excellent. Tatjana, we'll give you a few minutes to reply, and then we can have some time for Q&A.
Thank you. So I start with the question, the third question that Peter Sandøe raised. You asked whether the main claim of equal capacity for welfare across species is conceptual or empirical. I made the conceptual claim that some theories of welfare straightforwardly imply EQ. So one cannot accept these theories of welfare while rejecting EQ. I think this conceptual point has been underappreciated and deserves more attention. Whether you like EQ or not, it happens to come automatically with certain theories of welfare, which are called relativizing or proportional theories. And as a matter of fact, Peter Sandøe, as far as I know, you accept such a theory yourself. I quoted in the book, I don't know whether you changed your views, but you said a subject's welfare at a given point in time, T1, is relative to the degree of agreement between what it at T1 prefers and how it sees its situation. The better agreement, the better welfare. And this is just one example of a proportional view. And there are many others in the philosophical literature. So like a nature fulfillment view, a self-fulfillment view, certain versions of, and I think the most common versions of preferentialism, they all have this structure. And it is at least something we should know, that if we don't like EQ, we should somehow do away with these views, or we somehow need to reject these views and commit to certain other theories of welfare. So that is one, if you want, conceptual point that I made. Hedonism does not automatically come with EQ. So when talking to hedonists in the book, I made a claim about equal capacity for pleasure among sentient beings. And I think empirical science could potentially evaluate that claim by shedding light on the role of hedonicity in decision-making, because I argued that hedonicity, the function, the evolutionary function, is to assist decision-making on a pre-cognitive level. And this also relates to what Peter Singer said. You said that different animals differ in a lot of capacities, their capacity for hearing, for seeing, and so on. Why not also in their capacity for pleasure? And well, how do we find out that some animals have a better capacity for seeing or have better eyes? Yeah, they are better in fulfilling the functions that eyes have. We can somehow find that out. And if we agree that the function of hedonicity is to facilitate decision-making, quick, nearly automatic, nearly unconscious decision making on a pre-cognitive level, then we could check whether humans are better at that kind of decision making than other animals. And if so, then this points in the direction of better hedonic functioning or something. So I think that is a place where empirical science could be informative. And in addition, empirical scientists can shed light on which animal species possess hedonicity, are sentient, and there are still many open questions. Then I want to comment on insects. Some people feel inclined towards diff because they think that if insects are sentient, they are certainly not as sentient as we are. It is unimaginable, they claim, that insects are as sentient as we are, therefore diff must be true. Insects may turn out not to be sentient. In that case, that potential reason for accepting diff would disappear. But what if they are sentient? Then it would still really surprise us if they were as sentient as we are. But if they are sentient, then it would already have really surprised us that they are sentient in the first place. As you also said, Peter Sandøe, you didn't expect it, and I, for one, and I think most of us, also Peter Singer in previous writings, and we didn't expect insects to be sentient. So it would be a surprise if they now turned out to be sentient. The world would be very different from how we expected it to be. Our initial intuitions about insects would have been wrong. Living morally would be more difficult than we thought. In that case, why should we trust so much in our intuitions about insect sentience? Why should we build our argument against EQ on our intuitions about insect sentience or on our trust that moral life is easy? The more you are inclined to believe that they are sentient, the more you should distrust your intuitions about their sentience, or your trust. The more you should lose your trust in the ease of moral life. So then I want to comment on Travis' point about proportional views. Proportional views of different kinds are widely accepted and respected views about welfare. So if I'm right that they imply EQ, and no one contested this so far, then people who want to present proposals for how to compare welfare across species either must ignore proportional views, which seems utterly implausible. I mean, there are no knockdown arguments against these views, or they must allow for the possibility that EQ might be correct if these theories of welfare are correct. Now, let me talk a bit more about the specific example that Travis mentioned. So, in fact, there are like 3 different versions of preferentialism. There is proportional preferentialism. You are well off to the extent that your preferences are fulfilled rather than frustrated. Then there's moral ledger preferentialism, where unsatisfied preferences count negatively towards your welfare, and the best you can achieve is like neutral welfare level with no unsatisfied preferences. Satisfied preferences are neutral. And the third option is total preferentialism. The more satisfied preferences in absolute terms, the better off you are. So now proportional preferentialism has often been challenged along the lines that Travis suggested. Would a lobotomy make us better off? We would end up having only a few easily satisfied preferences. But similar challenges apply to hedonism. Most of us are not pleased all the time, but some simpler minds may be. Proportional preferentialists, as well as hedonists, typically answer these challenges with an appeal to identity or to some other prudentially relevant metaphysical unity relation. Roughly, would I still be the same person in a relevant sense after undergoing the lobotomy? If not, then the intervention would not benefit me. That is, how the discussion takes place. And until now, this hasn't been considered a knockdown argument against these views. Total preferentialism, which Travis seemed to consider more plausible, also faces major challenges. It would, in this view, benefit us to gain as many trivially satisfied desires as possible, such as the desire that my blood group will still be the same tomorrow. As soon as I desire this and it is fulfilled, my welfare goes up in this view. Implanting trivially satisfied desires, such as the desire that 1 + 1 = 2, in people should probably be a new priority for effective altruists in this view, which also seems implausible. And according to moral ledger preferentialism, lives cannot be good, but neutral at best, which also seems implausible. So you cannot just, decide between EQ and diff by doing away with certain theories of welfare. It's not that easy. The discussion is complex, and there are still many different theories of welfare on the table. What can I say? Perhaps a bit about making choices. I thought, or I wrote that the function of hedonicity is to assist us in making choices. And often people think, but we need more hedonicity because we have to choose among more options. When we think about choices, we tend to think about difficult choices with many options, what career to choose. But hedonicity did not evolve in our predecessors to help them make career choices by imagining how they would feel if they did this or that or 100 different things. We humans happen to be thinkers, and we can make choices by thinking about things, including thinking about our future feelings. These are slow, conscious, and effortful choices that are based on cognition. We forget that we make many effortless automatic choices every day, such as whether to put on or off a warm jumper, whether to drink some water or not. We make these choices based on how we feel at the moment. Are we cold? Are we warm? Are we thirsty? If you are cold, you move closer to the fire or put on a jumper. That brings you closer to homeostasis. You don't have to consciously monitor your body temperature. These are the kinds of choices that we base on hedonicity rather than cognition. And is there anything that suggests that we are better than other animals in making that kind of decisions based on how we feel at the time? Quick decisions about approach or avoidance. Decisions that direct our bodies towards homeostasis and that help us fulfill our basic social and emotional needs. I do not see that we are outperforming other animals in that kind of decision making. We are outperforming them in thinking, there's no doubt about that, but that is not, as far as I can see, the purpose of hedonicity, or it doesn't say anything about our hedonic capacities. And if you are a hedonist, you should be concerned with hedonicity, not with other things that we are good at. And even if we are choosing about 100 possible careers, we do not imagine these options all at once and apply expected utility scores to hundreds of options. That's not how it works. And even if it worked this way, we would not for this reason need a broader range of hedonicity. The highest high and the lowest low would be determined by how we expected to feel pursuing this career. The number of options does not change how we would feel pursuing this or that option. And then people often talk about us having more and deeper emotions than other animals. There are different theories about what emotions are. According to some plausible theories, emotions are cognitive labels that we put on certain bodily sensations, depending on our interpretation of the situation. So if we feel bad in certain situations, we call it anger. If we feel bad in other situations, we call it fear or sadness. And we learn how to use these words based on different interpretations of the situation. Scientists found no recognizable differences in our body or in our brains or in our action tendencies when they observed us being in these emotions. So what we call emotions are probably cognitive labels that can be helpful in our communication, but that are not really there in the body. So other animals may not make these cognitive distinctions, but that doesn't mean that they don't feel the underlying valence, the underlying hedonicity in the same way. Yeah, but and perhaps the last comment about, I don't know, welfare across time. I think these are different issues, like how well off are you at a particular point in time? And it depends on your theory of welfare, how you determine this. For example, if you accept a proportional theory of welfare, okay, it depends on the extent to which your needs are fulfilled or something like that. And then I think this view is perfectly compatible with the view that the longer your satisfied life is, the better for you, okay? I don't see this discrepancy between, on the one hand, accepting a proportional view, and on the other hand, accepting a symbol additive view about lifetime welfare. And I'm not committed to a proportional view about welfare. I mean, perhaps I also said that since I think that different species have the same capacity for pleasure, I would even say that if you accept hedonism in the end, this is compatible with equal capacity for welfare view. Yeah.
Great.
I think I will leave it here for the moment.
Great. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Tatjana. We have 15 minutes for questions. So if folks would just write, you don't have to write the actual question, but just write that you have a question in the chat. That will allow us to start a queue. And I'm looking forward to seeing who has something to say first. So who would like to begin with a question for Tatjana or anyone else? Leonard, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the book, and also thanks for today. My question concerns like how sensitive your evolutionary argument for equal capacity and pleasure is to variance or variations in like the theory of valence or like pleasure and pain you might hold. So I didn't really read your book yet, so please point out if I misunderstand your view or your argument. I mean, you seem to presuppose a view where mainly the function of valence or pleasure and pain is for decision making being like a common currency, so that like some things have positive valence, some things have negative valence, and then like unconsciously organisms usually do what maximizes expected positive valence. And I don't know, you might have the view that valence also has other functions, for instance, for learning or for just representing adaptive value. And I'm not sure whether on those views, maybe you might think that actually there are interspecies differences in valence. So for instance, learning, you might think that because like different animals are differ in how good they are at learning things, they need differentially strong signals for learning. So for instance, maybe some animals need like stronger pleasure or pain signals for learning than others. So maybe we should think that some animals have like stronger pain or stronger pleasure than others. Or for like representations of adaptive value, maybe some animals are more fragile, which is why just more stimuli can have like stronger adaptive disvalue than in animals which are not that fragile. And I mean, also if you think that just valence has different functions, the one for decision making, but also like the ones I pointed to, presumably it would suffice if it had like one of those functions which create evolutionary pressure for there being differences in welfare capacity for us to like such that we should expect that there are also well-being capacity differences. So yeah, I hope this relatively clear, but my question is basically like what happens if we have different views or like pluralist views on the function of valence of pain and pleasure?
Yeah. So there's one part of the argument that is like the conceptual part that says that some theories of welfare just imply EQ, and the other part is a theory such as hedonism doesn't like conceptually imply it, but perhaps as a matter of empirical fact. Yeah. And then you said that perhaps this could be challenged by certain empirical findings, also about the function of pleasure or its use in learning and so on. And there I would be very interested in open, yeah, to see what follows from this discussion. So I'm not an empirical scientist myself, and yeah, I'm open there to different options, and I think that pleasure plays a role in learning, but some beings also are good in cognition, and that can, of course, then also be used in learning. So differences in learning do not automatically, imply differences in hedonicity, because hedonicity is not the only thing that we can use in learning. But that kind of research would be really interesting. And what I don't like is certain claims that are neither make a lot of sense empirically speaking, nor do they acknowledge the breadth of theories of welfare in philosophy that are existing. Yeah. So, and for example, like the appeal to neuron counts, I don't see what's behind it. And Adam Schreiber has written a paper about it. It's not supported by empirical science, and it's also not supported by any philosophical link that I can see with any theory of welfare. So, and I think we sometimes have our intuitions, and we come up with some metrics that seems to shoot our intuitions. And this is perhaps the main reason why I wrote the book. We are often so uncareful when it comes to this. And everything that is more careful, I would welcome, also including empirical research, about pleasure and the function of pleasure and differences in capacity for pleasure. And to animal welfare scientists, I would really invite them to think perhaps more or make more explicit what their underlying theories of welfare are. They come up with indicators of welfare, okay, but they also have debates about, are these the right indicators or that the right indicators? They have that kind of debates. And in these debates that seem to appeal to underlying ideas about what welfare is. And sometimes they make this explicit. But when you point out what follows from the theories of welfare in terms of capacity for welfare across species, there's sometimes, oh, no, that's, I don't know. Even when I talk to Mark Bracke, he's like, oh, what I don't accept the equality view. That was not my intention. I don't claim that it was their intention, but well, tell me what your underlying theory of welfare is, and either you have to change it or accept the implications.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you. Tobias.
Yes, also from me, thank you, Tatjana. I've been thinking lately about how we should design AI, and whether we should design them to be very happy, to have a very high capacity of welfare, of pleasure, so to speak, and then also provide the circumstances that they can be fulfilled. And this could create big moral problems, because it will put very high constraints on building sentient AI. But I'm thinking maybe on your view, this would be a bit more simple, because we could simply give them a very light desire or something that's always fulfilled or something. So should we not, maybe then we don't have to think about these, about giving them this huge amount of pleasure, or what I would take to be pleasure. And maybe the same goes for genetically designing animals. What's your view on this?
Yeah, I think it depends on what your underlying theory of welfare is. if you accept a proportional desire fulfillment theory, give them one desire and make sure that it is fulfilled, and they will be maximally well off. If you are a hedonist, well, that raises a lot of empirical issues about whether they can ever feel pleasure. For all beings that I know that evolved in the course of evolution, I think it's nonsense to think that pleasure is something that can be maximized in the way that posthumanists imagine that it can. We don't work like this so far. If it is true that pleasure has this function, I think, as I write in the book, it's bounded. It's not like, we are not the kind of beings that can be in eternal bliss, and evolution doesn't care about our bliss. It's just a means for making decisions that promote our genes, that spread our genes. So I cannot, I don't know. For me, it doesn't make much sense what some people say about like having computers that feel eternal bliss and so on. It's neither empirically grounded nor, I don't know, conceptually. I have not much to say about this.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Thanks so much. Okay, so we have a question written out here. So what implications, this is from Jamie Woodhouse, what implications does the equality view have for, one, the sharpness and location of the sentience boundary in development or evolution or information processing, and two, the minimal moral obligations we might have to sentient beings?
Yeah, it has no implications for both. I mean, if what our obligations are depends on the normative view that we accept. We can be utilitarians or something else. That is an independent issue. And where the boundary of sentience lies, empirical scientists need to tell us. And if it turns out that insects are sentient, and if we are utilitarians, and if we accept the equal capacity for welfare view, that might have important and huge implications for how we ought to act, and it might make it more difficult for us. I hope for that reason, since I'm inclined towards like a maximizing view and so on, and equal moral status and so on, I can only hope that insects are not sentient. But if they are, then it would make life more difficult for us. But then it would also be for good reasons, you know, whether we like it or not. And then, yeah, if people can show me that the equal capacity for welfare view is wrong, that would make life easier again for us. But we should bring forward good arguments and not just simply assume it because it would make life more easy for us.
Very good. Thanks so much. I think we can at least get one more question in. Josh Milburn, go ahead.
Good morning. Thanks, Tatjana. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm really looking forward to getting hold of a copy. So I just had a quick question about the role of species in your argument. And I was wondering whether, well, basically, do you take it that species is something metaphysically or ethically significant in answering these questions? Or are you just using species as a kind of shorthand for beings with very different capacities?
The latter, I think. Yeah, I have no particular view about species, and I don't think it's relevant. I think the individuals matter because they experience things like pleasure and pain and so on. But in the discussion, well, it is contested whether different species have different capacities for welfare. So I just, you know, try to talk to or make a contribution to this discussion. But I don't think that species as such is morally relevant.
Thank you.
Great. Well, that went so quickly. We may be able to get the very last one in. Derek Foster, do you have a view on whether welfare is symmetrical? That is, assuming hedonism, whether the worst pains are stronger than the best pleasures, and does this differ among species?
I haven't thought much about it. And again, I would say I don't take a position on what welfare is in the book, but there are different theories of welfare that have different implications for whether it's symmetrical or not. And yeah, and for some theories of welfare, you also need to look at empirical science. For example, if you are a hedonist, then you would also have to consider like what we know about capacities for pleasure and pain. And I have no particular view about that.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much for that reply. And that, I mean, it's an important, interesting issue, complicated, worth thinking about, but we will leave that one for another day, perhaps the next book after you've finished all the other things that you want to work on. Folks, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to all those who've offered comments. Thank you for the discussion about this issue. Tatjana, I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of reception the book gets in the broader philosophical audience. It will be great to see more discussion about the question of how to make these sorts of welfare comparisons. So really grateful that everyone took some time out of their day, chat with us. Thank you again for being here. Looking forward to next time. So take care, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.